Yeah, I think this is kind of interesting how, the internet makes all these things possible. Okay, so, oops, not from here.
Right.
So,
That's given us a pretty good introduction. Actually, he's told us that we need to speak slower and with a higher voice because the connection makes it difficult to understand otherwise. But I'm Song, and here on the screen with me is Masha, all the way in Philadelphia, whereas I'm in New Zealand at the bottom of the world. And we met about 6 months ago, when I was just starting to run the Philosopher's meme, which I intended to use as a kind of a journalistic website / blog where I can discuss relevant and interesting philosophical issues that arise. But it turned into something different along the way, where we started trying to attract people into doing philosophy and discussing philosophy with each other on the internet by using humor. And one of our projects is to make philosophy easier to understand so that people with radically different opinions, especially political, can come together and have an easier time understanding each other's usually off-putting perspectives on issues that they feel strongly about. And along the way, we learned a lot about memes and how they behave. And eventually we came up with the way to classify them and to analyze them, and we even ended up predicting a particular trend in memes on Facebook, and went on to make a very successful new project of internet art that we've begun calling meme art. It's a silly term because the word meme itself has become a meme and has taken on a very different meaning from the original meaning, the original use, which we'll see on the next slide here. So, as you can see, there's been a whole bunch of different approaches to attempting to define meme in a useful way, or in even a meaningful way. Initially, and I'm pretty sure anyone interested in memes has heard this one before, where initially it was invented by Richard Dawkins as an attempt to start explaining culture in a more, I suppose, scientific way. But don't worry about this table for now. Let's move on to the next slide. Basically, Dawkins' initial definition of memes became a meme, and it became an extremely popular concept for biologists who are interested in how culture might mimic evolution of biological organisms. And so concepts of meme as a unit of culture, or memorable information, symbolic representation, observable cultural phenomenon, and unit of imitation, and all of these various definitions arose as an attempt to better operationalize memes for measurement and generally easier use in practical science, like measuring the path of how memes move around and so on. But I think 4 different tiers of the definitions are recognizable in all of the different approaches that the scientists have taken since the 70s. the size of the meme unit that they propose varies between information to cultural artifacts. And I think it's best understood in a metaphor using atoms and molecules. If we consider information, which is just data stored in one form or another in either brains or brain-like objects like a computer, then an idea is made up of informations. And in turn, ideas, which are mental representations of objects in the real world, make up behaviors insofar as the idea is behavior is a expression of ideas in the culture, and eventually these behaviors result in cultural artifacts, and these cultural artifacts are what we're going to be looking at today, which are internet memes, and these cultural artifacts are like phenotypes to the genotype of the meme. So on the next slide, first, memes began as an analogy to genes, and Dawkins, in his book, The Selfish Gene, didn't really talk about memes except for in just one chapter, because the entire book was based around what he calls a selfish replicator. And a replicator is just a thing that has the capacity of being copied and spreading. And in the book, he's trying to draw the attention of the general public and the scientists to the fact that it's genes that are selected for rather than the organisms themselves, as the famous line, "The survival of the fittest," is often misinterpreted. And he thinks that, in the book, he thought at least, that culture could be constructed in the same way as organisms or species, where units of ideas spread around like abiological replicators. And they also evolve just like biological replicators in that various selection pressures act upon them, and the less popular ones that are less likely to spread die out. Well, on the next slide, we'll see the three traits of a good replicator that Dawkins lists in his book, and it's longevity, fidelity, and fecundity. And just like with biological genes, how long they stick around, how accurate each of the copy is, and how often they're copied all contribute to the spread of memes. But unlike genes, the strategy varies far more than memes, because of the fact that selection is teleological insofar as people are acting upon memes by filtering them and only spreading the ones that they like. And so on the next slide, I'll show you how. See, this is a pretty good diagram of the internet, I think. And internet memes exist on the internet. First of all, that's a pretty obvious one, but we have to initially set out what we're going to be talking about, because one of the biggest criticisms in Memetics has been that it doesn't seem to be talking about anything specific when it refers to something that makes up culture as a meme. Well, internet memes are cultural artifacts on the internet that exist as a kind of art, even if they're terrible art most of the time. They exist as oral, visual, or linguistic objects on the internet, and they exist cybernetically. That just means that they exist in a network of machines and humans. And so internet memes are a special kind of art, and they're like art organisms that are simulated on the internet, and they spread around like genes or viruses between computers that are connected through the internet. That means that their analysis has to be two-tiered. First of all, the memetic, which I've been explaining so far, and the aesthetic. And on the next slide, I'll show you a more nuanced approach to memetics, which developed later on, presumably because the internet provided the scientists with a better idea of how memes can act. And so instead of just genes, people started seeing memes as kind of viruses or virus analogs. And so the difference here is that viruses can't spread or reproduce without the help of hosts. And another is that just like viruses or viral infections, memes seem to spread in an epidemiological fashion. And Dan Sperber comes up with the idea of the epidemiology of representations, by which he means essentially that memes are like units of culture, but they're not copies of things like the likes of Susan Blackmore suggest. She just won't stop talking about how they're mimics of something that another person has done, or TED Talks and such. But Sperber's concept of representation is something that exists as an idea in your brain of another thing that is perceived in real life. But they're not copies in the same way that genes are, which attempt to faithfully replicate the physical makeup of the original. Memes are like they're reconstructed in the brain. This is obvious. I mean, insofar as memes spread through ideas, the person perceives something and takes it in, and it becomes stored as information in the brain. And later on, when the memes spread, they're encoded into a message and sent out to other people who decode the message, and then the information is taken in and stored in their own brains in the form of information. And so, essentially, memes spread from brain to brain like viruses, according to the likes of Sperber. And let's go on to the next slide. But in Rich Dawkins does also mention in about 20 years after he first publishes The Selfish Gene that memes are like computer viruses, but we'd go as far as say that they even technically are computer viruses assisted by people. And so on the slide here we can see kind of it's a psychological experiment that Tamaras and Kirby did on about 300 people, where they made them play a kind of Chinese whispers using pictures. So the one numbered 0 on each row was the first picture that they handed out to the first participant. And then the next one saw the copy that the first one made for a brief moment and tried to reproduce it on his own piece of paper, and it went on and on like that in a chain of participants until around number 22 it becomes completely unrecognizable, but also results in a pattern of symbols or representations that the participants began to recognize in the pictures that they were being passed. And this is probably our most promising candidate for defining the internet meme, because it's talking about information as the base unit rather than some kind of a speculative cultural atom like the early concept of a meme as gene analogs. So on the next slide here, I made a nice picture out of some whales that I found on Google, where all I did was slap meme onto the whales. It's basically showing how culture spreads. The original picture was about culture spreading between whales, and just like with viral infections, culture can spread both within the generation, between organisms, as well as between generations from parent to child, which is respectively shown as horizontal transmission within generation and vertical transmission from parent to child, or oblique transmission from one generation to the next with no kin relation. And in the same way, representations spread. But what's more interesting is that memes also take on the characteristics of other memes when they're exposed to one another. And this possibility is accentuated by the fact that memes, especially on the internet, have no real cost of reproducing, because the only cost that really exists for memes is opportunity cost in the form of one action having different payoff than another. For instance, a meme might become too boring if it becomes popular too quick, like Gangnam Style or something, like, you know, the ones that everyone gets sick of after about a month. Whereas memes that spread as a kind of a cult phenomenon might have a better chance at surviving for longer, because the gradual spread of memes makes them into more of steady state memes. Anyway, so on the next slide I'll show that we identified in the green here all the best theories that have come up over the last nearly half century, I think. Basically what we end up with is the idea that evolution of internet memes is both Darwinian and Lamarckian, in that not only are they selected for not only are they selected for evolutionarily with information as the base unit, their characteristics are acquired during their lifetimes and passed on to the next generation. And more importantly, they mix and remix. So on the next slide.
So,
yeah,
can we do a quick stop just to ask if there are any questions?
Oh yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Everybody knows the difference between Darwinian and Lamarckian evolution?
Oh, we'll have a slide explaining that.
No. Yeah? Okay. And so, maybe you can speak a little slower.
Slower?
And, yeah.
Okay.
And for some reason, we always see Masha when you speak. And when you make a pause, we see you.
Is there a way that we can?
Okay, yeah. I don't know.
We want you guys to see the slide anyway.
Yeah, okay.
Well, do
Alright,
do you
so,
have the screen share? If you click on the screen share, it should theoretically be brought to the forefront.
I don't see any screen sharing, but it's okay. It's okay. As you said, it's more important to see the the slides than
Wait.
the person.
Do you see the slides?
Yeah. We right now we don't see the slides, but before we saw the slides.
Okay, the slides are where the screen share is happening. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the screen is shared, but the Skype window is in front of the
Yeah,
slide
yeah,
window.
yeah.
So.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry for
that's okay.
pausing.
Where were we?
It's Lamarckian slide 44, so if you want to go down there.
Oh, you moved it there? Okay.
41, yeah. Right. Well, in high school biology, people make Lamarckian evolution because...
Oh, Philip, can you turn off the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, everyone who's taken biology in high school will have heard of Lamarckian evolution as a weird comparison against natural selection of Darwin, because the Lamarckian theory says that traits acquired within an organism's lifetime can then be passed on to the next generation. And the most popular example seems to be the giraffe, who stretches out its neck so as to reach leaves higher up in a tree, and eventually has children who are born with longer necks because somehow the acquired trait of a stretched out neck is passed on to the next generation. But in natural selection, the evolutionary process happens on a population scale of slightly longer necks having a higher chance of being passed down in the genes by the sheer virtue of having conferring a slightly higher chance of the organism who has that trait passing on its own genes. And over time, all the giraffes with slightly shorter necks die out, and eventually giraffes end up with very, very long necks. But recent epigenetic theories do suggest that some Lamarckian evolution is a plausible thing, because some things that happen during an individual's lifetime can influence the way their germ cells behave or are produced. The important thing about Lamarckian evolution is that mimetic evolution is not just Darwinian, it's also Lamarckian, in that means that throughout its lifetime acquire new characteristics will continue to be passed on, or continue to pass on whatever traits that they acquire, insofar as it's not too detrimental to their reproductive success. Now let's go back to slide 11. So what I'm trying to show here with the bacteria is that bacteria do this interesting thing where they swap genetic material from one another. And sometimes they do it by themselves, sometimes viruses help them out. But the slight error in analogy between bacteria and memes versus viruses as viruses and memes is of no concern to us here. The important aspect is that internet memes have convey more than one idea, and are filled up with a lot of information, and a lot of the time they get remixed, just like genes within bacteria remix when one bacterium comes across another, that it can do that. And so that's where we end up with the theory of memetics in terms of internet memes. It's that an internet meme is something more complex than a meme in the general sense of the word, and it's almost always made up of more than one meme within each internet meme. And that's why we have to go on and talk about them also in terms of their artistic nature. And so I'll pass it on to Masha now.
Okay. Oops.